In the shadow of such titans of Roman politics as Pompey or Caesar, there were always second or even third-rate figures who often had to do the main job and were rarely rewarded for it. Most of the names and information about their lives have not survived to our time because of the small role that these people had to play in history. Quintus Caecilius Bassus is one of them. We know neither the year of his birth nor the circumstances of his death, and his name has been preserved only because at a certain point he had to play by chance, though brief, but quite an important role in a tight knot of contradictions of Roman politics in the era of the civil wars. About the origin and the beginning of the career of Quintus Caecilius Bassus, nothing is reliably unknown. Appian sets out at once two contradictory versions. According to the first, Bassus was an old and experienced officer whom Caesar left in Syria at the head of the legion standing there. The governor of the province was appointed Sextus Julius Caesar, a relative of the dictator who held the post of quaestor. Sextus Caesar led a pampered lifestyle. Their relationship with Bass did not work out, which eventually led to the most unfortunate consequences. According to another version, also voiced by Appian, Bass was by origin a Roman horseman, served earlier in the army of Pompey the Great, and after the defeat at Pharsalus, fled to Tyre in Phoenicia. This version, according to Appian, goes back to the account of a certain Libon, in which modern historians see either the name of Titus Livius distorted by medieval scribes, or the name of Lucius Scribonius Libon, a prominent supporter of Pompey after the Battle of Pharsalus, reconciled with Caesar, and for a time withdrew from politics. If it is about him, the second hypothesis gets a very reliable basis. Later historians also call Bassus Pompeian. As Cassius Dion writes, for several months Bassus lived in Tyre as a private citizen, content already to be left alone. And when the civil war broke out again in Africa, where the most prominent opponents of Caesar took refuge. Sympathizing with their cause, Bass began to secretly collect money and conduct subversive conversations with the soldiers standing in Tyre garrison. These actions did not escape the attention of Sextus Caesar, and on his orders Bass was arrested. However, this time he managed to get away with it, pretending that the money and people were intended for the expedition Mithridates of Pergamon against the Bosporus, which was being prepared at that time. Perhaps Bassus did recruit soldiers on his behalf, hence the version retold by Appian about him as one of the officers left by Caesar in Syria. In any case, the explanations provided by Bass seemed to Sextus Caesar plausible, and he was released. In late December of the same year, Gaius Julius Caesar with 6 legions landed in Africa. The beginning of hostilities was unfavorable for him, and in the provinces spread the most fantastic rumors. Bassus decided that it was time to act. According to the story of Cassius Dion, Bass either received or himself produced a letter from Metellus Scipione, which reported the defeat and death of Caesar in Africa, the removal of the current governor of Syria, and the appointment of him, Bass, a new governor. With the letter in hand, Bassus revolted the men under him and occupied Tyre. Strabo reports that Bassus had only 2 cohorts, but he moves the scene to Apamea in Syria. Be that as it may, Sextus Caesar ordered Bassus to report to his headquarters, and upon his refusal, ordered his arrest. Further events are presented in the sources in 2 ways. According to Appian, the soldiers who hated Sextus Caesar for his dissolute lifestyle conspired against him and killed him, and Bassus was proclaimed their commander. In this account, nothing is said of the forged letter, nor of the speech of Bassus. Cassius Dion's version fits into the same framework, but appears to be more detailed. Sextus Caesar with his legion came against Bassus, and in the first clash defeated him. Bassus himself was wounded and no longer dared to take open military action. Instead, he bribed some of Sextus Caesar's soldiers and incited the others to mutiny against the unpopular commander-in-chief. In the ensuing skirmish, Sextus Caesar was pierced with a spear. Left without a commander, the soldiers proclaimed Bassus their commander. Having seized control of the army, Bassus gave himself the insignia of commander-in-chief and the title of praetor. His deception with the false letter could not last long. The true state of affairs sooner or later was to be revealed, but now the soldiers themselves, who had stained their hands with the blood of their commander, feared Caesar's revenge for the murder of his relative and demanded that Bassus led them to the end. This enthusiasm was by no means universal. The soldiers wintering at Apamea refused to recognize Bassus as commander. Before he appeared at the walls of Apamea accompanied by his troops, the soldiers had left, and with all their supplies had gone to Cilicia. Bassus tried to pursue them, but was unable to prevent them. Returning back to Apamea, he fortified the city and made it his base. In anticipation of more clashes, he began recruiting troops everywhere in the province, raising money and bringing in provisions. Pompey's name was still respected in Syria. It is probable that some of the veterans whom Pompey had dispersed in the province came under the banners of Bassus. Cassius Dio states that Bassus received not only free slaves, but also runaway slaves. In addition to the legion he already had, Bassus managed to recruit another. His soldiers practiced their military skills intensively. Bassus sent letters requesting help to the Parthians as well as to the Galatian tetrarch Deiothar. The latter was considered a staunch ally of Pompey and for this reason had lost some of his possessions after his defeat at Pharsalus. Bassus was also supported by local Arab chiefs and princes of the mountainous part of Lebanon, many of whom owed Pompey power. In Rome, letters about the events in Syria reached Rome after the news of Caesar's victory at the Battle of Thapsus. At first, this news was not given importance. Caesar, busy dealing with the consequences of the civil war in Africa and long nurtured his projects of reform in Italy, reacted only in the second half of the year. In place of the dead Sextus, Caesar dictator appointed governor of neighboring Cilicia Quintus Caecilius, instructing him also to deal with the rebels. We have a letter from Cicero sent to Caecilius in which he reported on rumors in Rome about the unrest in Syria. In another letter written at the end of the same year, Cicero congratulates Caecilius on his new appointment. However, Caecilius did not have time or did not want to take any effective measures to suppress the rebellion. In the spring of the same year, he departed for Italy. Instead of Caecilius, Caesar sent to Syria Gaius Antistius Veta, a former quaestor, who received here praetoric powers. Antistius had an army of 3 legions. With these forces he began to fight with Bassus around Apamea. There is no reliable information about the course of hostilities. Antistius probably had some major success, since it is known that the soldiers proclaimed him emperor. Bassus was forced to take refuge behind the city walls. While the siege continued, both armies received aid from their allies. A detachment of infantry and cavalry sent to Antistius by the Idumean Antipater arrived. At the head of the soldiers were the sons of Antipater, one of whom was Herod, who later became famous. To the aid of Bassus from across the Euphrates came the Arab sheikh Al-Hidam, who had previously been an ally of Lucius Licinius Lucullus, and then went beyond the Euphrates and began to serve the Parthians. Called to the aid of both sides at once, he set up his camp between the wall of the city and the fortifications of the besiegers. Apparently, Bassus succeeded in outbidding his adversary, and eventually Al-Hidam's archers became a serious aid to him in the continuous skirmishes. A Parthian detachment led by the Prince Pacorus also arrived, but due to the impending winter, the Parthians soon returned home. Antistius also experienced increasing supply problems and was eventually forced to return to Cilicia. Bassus thus once again remained master of the situation. Perhaps one of the reasons that forced Antistius to withdraw his troops from the walls of Apamea was the news he received of Caesar's assassination in Rome. This event radically changed the entire balance of power in the provinces and the position of Bassus himself. The changes that took place are well illustrated by the change in the tone of Cicero's letters. If, addressing Caesar, he calls Bassus no other than raging madman, then after Caesar's death, Cicero writes about him as a natural ally and support of the Republicans. The intrigue was that Syria had still been assigned as a province by Caesar to Gaius Cassius Longinus, and Cicero dreamed that Bassus's battle-tested legions would become the nucleus of the Republican army in the east. Bassus was also well aware that alone he could not stand against his enemies. Therefore, on the one hand, he sent his emissaries to Egypt, to the 4 legions of Caesar standing in Alexandria, whom he persuaded to come to his side. On the other hand, Bassus also tried to contact the Republicans in Rome, assuring Cicero of his readiness to join their cause. The heirs of the murdered dictator, among whom the consul Mark Antony played a major role, were determined to prevent the possible strengthening of the Republicans. Antony passed a law in the People's Assembly, according to which Cassius, instead of Syria, was to get Cyrenaica, where he was to buy bread for the Roman people. The Syrian viceroyalty and the continuance of the war against Bassus were given to Lucius Statius Mercus, praetor. Antistius gave him his 3 legions and himself left for Rome to take part in the election of magistrates for the following year. In Greece, Antistius met Marcus Junius Brutus and gave him the money collected in the province. These funds were a great help to the Republicans. Meanwhile, Mercus had resumed hostilities against Bassus. Apparently, he immediately encountered serious difficulties. Appian writes that Mercus was defeated by Bassus and called for help the governor of Bithynia, Quintus Martius Crispus. He came to Syria with his 3 legions. With a total of 6 legions, Mercus and Crispus again drove Bassus into the walls of Apamea. The siege of the city was renewed and continued until Cassius arrived in Syria. The position of the Republicans had again changed. In Italy at this time, civil war broke out again between Antony and the Senate party. Antony and his troops moved into Cisalpine Gaul to besiege Mutina. At this time, Cicero, taking advantage of the weakened position of the Caesarians in the Senate, passed a law transferring military command over all the eastern provinces to Brutus and Cassius. Appearing in Syria, Cassius demanded of all an immediate cessation of hostilities. Mercus and Crispus recognized his rights and transferred their 6 legions to him, with Mercus entering the service of Cassius as legate. Bassus also paid lip service to his submission. In a letter sent to Rome by Cicero, Cassius reports that he had transferred 1 legion to him. With 6 or 7 legions, Cassius managed to surround and force the surrender of 4 legions led from Egypt by his opponent, Aulus Alienus. However, then something went wrong. And in the next letter, dated May 7th of the same year, Cassius writes that Bassus meanly refused to give him the 2nd legion and retained Apamea. Doubtless Bassus had intended to hold on to the city to the last strength, but his soldiers, who had grown weary of the hardships of the siege over 2 years, sent parliamentarians to Cassius against the will of their commander and agreed to open the gates to him. Cassius Dion's account suggests that Bassus was able to surrender on certain conditions. He refused to join Cassius and was sent away with Crispus and others. The further fate of Caecilius Bassus is lost in darkness.